always nice to get a report from on the ground from these delegations that are actually engaged in the citizen diplomacy that is just absolutely necessary to building bridges across societies, especially between countries that are portrayed as adversaries of the United States of America. So good on our activists for doing the work. And without further ado, I'd like to get us started. This is the Hugo Chavez delegation returns from Venezuela, featuring Ellen Mass and Martha Schmidt. Now, as many of you know, Venezuela has been a major target of US restrictive measures and sanctions that have really had a terrible effect on social justice and equity in Venezuela. They've really stunted that country's development. That development that had such promise as laid out by Hugo Chavez and now the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. The country has dealt with more than just sanctions. It's dealt with invasions and economic sabotage and guerrilla incursions from Colombia, which is of course a big ally of the United States. The government has boosted the global campaign to free diplomat and businessman Alex Saab, who you're going to hear about. His case is very important. A diplomat who was arrested without warrant while seeking medical supplies, food, and fuel in Iran for Venezuela. And he was extradited, or to be more accurate, kidnapped to Miami, Florida. His present health condition in prison remains dire, and that's why it's very important to bring his case into the light. Ellen and Martha are going to report on the world gathering that they attended, the anniversary of Hugo Chavez's death. They attended this encuentro with hundreds of delegates from over 70 countries, 600 delegates, 5 nations presidents spoke and shared the impact of Venezuela's positive revolutionary gains on many sectors, and as well as the difficulties of national security measures and opposing some of these intense neoliberal measures that have been imposed by the United States and our allies. Conference leaders were presidents of Nicaragua, Honduras, Venezuela, Bolivia, Dominica, Cuba. Well, you're going to hear all about it, and I think you're in for a treat tonight. So I want to bring in our speakers without further ado. Ellen, I believe you're going first, right?
Yes.
Yeah, let me put you up on the screen with me. I'm sure many of you know Ellen, but Ellen is a longtime activist now with Massachusetts Peace Action and many other groups. But she has a master's in political science from Goddard College, 19 years of teaching experience, which included a citywide Sister Cities social studies program to pair with the capital of Armenia. That was arranged by the Cambridge Peace Commission in the 1980s. She's been doing political work since the Vietnam War days, starting at Brandeis University at a strike against the Vietnam War, and has participated in rallies ever since, writing articles. She's done environmental work as well, and conservation, environmental protection, founded a 20-year nonprofit in that area. And now she's working with us on anti-imperialism with the Latin America and Caribbean Working Group, working on preventing intervention and ending the harmful and, in fact, deadly U.S. sanctions on countries in Latin America. So I want to turn it over to you, Ellen, so we can hear a little bit about your experience.
Thank you, Brian. It's such an honor to do this. It's not my forte or experience to be here with MAPA and to share this with friends and members of MAPA and friends who are interested in Venezuela. So I just say right off, greetings to MAPA members and friends who are who remain curious and aware of the importance of Venezuela in the global Central American South and its growing social, economic, and political influence on the world stage, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. Now, I'm making a disclaimer now that I'm not a specialist in representing a group about this marvelous country. So I'll present a more personal overview of my 10-day sponsored trip by the Alliance for Global Justice, which in my signing up was having issues maintaining its regular programs because of technical and financial attacks, undermining its functioning. But presently, it is still able to send you and me to Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and other changing places for a pittance. Most of my trip money was spent on the airlines. So just so you know, you have an opportunity to really see the world through some of these delegations, and I greatly encourage you to do so. And Martha, who's sharing this with me, was my roommate in Caracas and in Valencia, and on the airplane where we were cramped up for too long. My personal motivation has come from 2 years of constant posting events and analysis with my progressive MAPA Latin America Caribbean Committee Working Group, inundating them with a good variety of contemporary news about points that the group was discussing at the time. I pursued progressive news through newsletters of Venezuela analysis, Kawsechun, I didn't say that correctly, Kawsechun. It's an Indian name, but it's very well respected throughout Latin America. This is with Camila Escalante, and the global satellite media of Telesur, which I hope everybody has discovered by now. And also mainstream news as well. So I followed socially progressive political developments, so stunning to view from afar the determination to stop the outside invasive incursions and blockades in Venezuela. Even the Iranian ships were bringing desperately needed fuel through three major seas, reaching the Central American coast and being greeted hostilely with US military ships. So the vice president was in the helicopter on the Telesur, ushering these ships, giant fuel ships in from going through 3 different oceans, really. And they persevered through big help with citizens receiving the needed gas for their cars and for their industry. So I had sensed the importance of Venezuela from the Chavez days 15 years ago and listened to social criticisms labeling autocratic rule from colleagues who said these boisterous macho leaders only give orders and ignore women's rights or women's roles. But I found it not so when I was actually there, and I listened and watched closely. Women take much leadership as decision makers, such as Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, so well respected. Respected as well as Nicolas Maduro, I found. Recently deceased and now celebrated, Tbilisi Lucene was both a beloved minister of higher education, and she was also former president of the Venezuela National Council. And that has been quite strikingly in the news, and Martha actually knew her. From this trip and my Cuban one, I learned women are more politically outspoken in the US, especially about their own country and its status and achievements. It was remarkable how powerful they came across and how comfortably they spoke out in all forums. Do I see that we still have people trying to get in? Do you see that? Okay. After my travels were over, I noticed my own colleagues still continued to maintain somewhat of a biased, outdated, and undeveloped definition of individual freedom. They say we have and they don't, which I now see and understand as a natural response because we have the privilege. However, it is short-sighted for those of us with social and economic opportunities and daily choices. So the we or the community world can be omitted from a vital global understanding without depriving the privileged I person. Every morning I had the experience of meeting a vegetable fruit truck black man who would just smiling so brightly, I couldn't help but ask him what these particular fruits were that I didn't know what they were. And we would have a Spanish English lesson. So he would try to teach me what those fruits were. And every time I went by him, I forgot the Spanish name for those fruits. But what I noticed was that he was so just alive, energetic, and everybody that passed by treated him like a compañero, like a neighbor. He was not, even though he was very thin and he looked like very countryside, hard working life. He was one of the neighbors, and that it was a middle class neighborhood. So that was my little things like that stood out and made my morning very nice. So since '59, I was a Fidel fan and saw that a leader must show power, love, and deep understanding to receive leadership from the people, to receive accepted leadership from the people. I was thrilled to note Venezuela parallels Cuba with this insistence on friendly and embracing social equality. This was noted on wall scenes within the city and without. I found out that the global South populations are undergoing and in fact guiding a genuine revolution for sovereignty and prosperity, which continue from '59 to this day with leaders like former Chavez and Maduro and the great freedom commandante, then called La Liberator, Simon Bolivar, with the nation unfolding with new approaches to social problems, citizen recognitions, new appointees, new economic and financial policies, and new housing units. About 4 million have been built in concert with Russia. This was before all this new alliance building between other superpowers in Latin America that are going on right now. But so, and they also have, they're really proud of their improved medical treatment and drugs and food growth. You know that Venezuela was developed some of its own vaccine and was able to inoculate most of its population very successfully. Now, at the Colectivo distribution centers, one we visited in Valencia, the mayor talked to the collectives growing and selling on a weekly basis, with members voicing problems and needs and successes, so that financing healthy food and good health became a successful economic norm. Seems they are popular and growing, but also must compete with small private farms and expanding supermarkets. I twisted my knee. I wasn't able to attend that entire commune discussion with the mayor, but they do buy the land. These are cooperatives that purchase land, seed it, sow it, harvest it, sell it, or bake it, or bake or cook or whatever is needed there. Or if it's raw, they sell it in their own little stores. And this is still successful. I never got a sense of how much it's expanded or what the future plans are for that. but now, as I mentioned, Venezuela is working with other national superpowers for mutual benefit and trade because of Venezuela's rich natural resources. And also to help economically, as was done during the pandemic during those extreme US sanctions. And they're still going on, of course. That's one of the big issues for going on a delegation, is to try to relieve the country from these sanctions that prevent them working financially and economically in a normal way. So we saw the creative products and native grown foodstuffs brought to local markets that help sustain and often supplement one's individual income. And the promotion of natural organic development is something that is, you might say, is a positive outcome of the sanctions, because people must do this. And they want to do it, and they're finding that there's a market for it. I bought the stomach settling herbs, the natural jams, honey, and I saw some homemade liqueur at the open market. And this is the day of the Hugo Chavez celebration, and danced in a salsa line dance, but it was still a line dance that I was familiar with, in this beautiful Caracas Central Park on the commemoration day. But this went on all over the city. The people were celebrating his social justice legacy that began to live throughout our stay within each of our US delegations' heart and soul. You could see that. It was penetrating, and it was getting to us. You know, they were celebrating Chavez, who none of us, I think, had ever met, of course. He died 10 years ago. But you felt the love of a compañero who had achieved so much for the people. So in fact, everyone can actually follow the successful history-making experiment on YouTube if you would like to feel and be a part of the Maduro social justice revolution today, which was highly upscaled to us during those historic. It was upscaled for our benefit. All these delegations that Brian mentioned, that they were about 600-700 people there, and they were from 70 countries. But they were more countries than that, because they had a lot of individuals. They weren't formally recognized delegations, but people came from all over the world for this moment. But because of the rapid, intense scaling up of this year of services, housing, and with new and expanded production, they're now raising buffalo as a major product. You know, so they're getting new schools, water projects are expanding, cultural activity, and large social human demonstrations. Demonstrations were everywhere, or at least people in the streets for one reason or another, and it was all related to this this anniversary. And they're also, in terms of expanding things, they're expanding their socialist government policies, meaning they're very articulate that they are a socialist country. They're not saying we're just trying to manage. They're making it very clear they have socialist policies, which are something that I've not studied, but I understand it's quite, I'm not sure which theoretical or formal socialist policies they're following. But they're also extensively cracking down on crime and corruption. And so that is what is stated. When I say they're doing this is from everything that I have gathered, and from our delegation, and from very fine people who are sharing this information with us. They're also expanding the military education and integration with civil and military, and they're doing a lot more cultural exchange. they're working within the National Assembly to prevent further class warfare or conflict, because there is quite a bit of wealthy, prosperous enterprise in Venezuela that is not behind the Maduro government. They would like to see a change. So, and that is the right wing of the Maduro government. So they're determined with support from the US to undermine his candidacy when he comes up, because the election is coming up. They're pointing to shortages and effects of the sanctions placed on his watch. Much of the media also is run by conservatives. So if you go to YouTube, if you go and you look for these things, you will find the conservative media saying something different. Everywhere we moved in around the city, we viewed landscape and mountainous splendors of small, colorful dwellings, devoid of sad scenes of hunger, abuse, poverty, and homelessness. I did not see this social deficit. If it was there, I did not see it. Before coming, I drenched myself in Simon Bolivar history. And we'll have that on the chat, the book that I'm promoting to read if you don't pay attention to the last sentence in the book. But it's a book that will give you the real incredible history of the liberation of Latin America in that particular era. And we did go to the scene of his one of his battles that is considered so famous for people who love military strategy. It's called the battle scene of Carabobo, where things turned and Venezuela was liberated. At that time, it was a marvelous memorial area in Valencia, and also Gran Colombia was created at that time. That was designated at the time. So you know, this was the battles where they were defeating the Spanish royalists. Coming to an end. I wanted to say just something about the view, because these small, flat top, tightly grouped, colorful dwellings along the highway and all up and down the mountainsides was constant as we moved to museums, restaurants, daily places, and we visited the neighborhoods of the revolution, such as the January 23rd, that supported and was actually brought Hugo Chavez to power. It was not easy to get him in there because Venezuela has a whole very different history. But we did go to those neighborhoods, and you could see everywhere the murals on the walls and the signs that gave the heart and soul of that neighborhood. And they were still very strong. It was, you felt like you were in the period of Hugo Chavez, actually. And they reinforced it all. The Chavez period was, and the movement was 1999 to 2013, just so you get a sense of timing there. And he is known for his victory over a great deal of poverty. So those people were out in full when we were there as a delegation, supporting International Women's Day and supporting Chavez. So maybe this is the time to stop so you can share in the encuentro. It was 4 days of the theater. It was the former opera house. Teresa, I forgot the name of her last name. It was a gorgeous architectural wonder where we were for 3 days. And we heard presidents of 5 countries, plus many intellectuals, music, and these delegations were there all sitting together with their T-shirts and jumping up and really constantly giving slogans of empowerment, anti-imperialism, and personal empowerment. Go see Cuba. Cubans, a lot of Cubans were there. and we were there, and we had some translation even on our headphones, so we were pretty happy. So, Brian, do you want to play the intro? I'm getting tired of my voice here.
Yeah, I'm absolutely ready, so the crowd can see some of it for themselves. So if you just bear with me, but you can also, tell us what we're seeing here. I'm going to share my sound.
Well, I just picked 5 of the 10 speakers, so you could share it, and you're even going to get the subtitles.
All right.
Presidente obrero Nicolas Maduro, presidentes.
Well, this is Maduro speaking.
Expresidentes.
Oh no, this is Zeal from
Vicepresidentes de la República.
From Honduras.
Venezuela.
Former president, he was overthrown.
Estos momentos para nosotros, que vivimos esa gesta heroica, junto a ustedes, junto al pueblo de América Latina, momentos de emoción intensa y de trascendencia histórica de la vida y obra del supremo comandante de la Revolución Bolivariana, Hugo Chavez Frías. Quiero enviar un mensaje a aquellos que celebraron el fallecimiento de Hugo Chávez, aquellos que creyeron que por esa causa el pueblo de Venezuela sería presa fácil del imperialismo, aquellos que usan las ONG y las financian desde Europa y los Estados Unidos para desestabilizar los procesos revolucionarios de nuestros pueblos, para aquellos que han intentado asesinar los líderes de la Revolución Bolivariana, para aquellos que emprendieron juicios políticos, lawfare contra dirigentes y líderes de Latinoamérica, para aquellos que dieron y ejecutaron perversamente golpes de Estado en Honduras, en Brasil, en Paraguay, en Ecuador, para aquellos que todavía ejecutan crueles, infames genocidio, bloqueo a la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, a Nicaragua y a la hermana República de Cuba. Para todos esos aves de mal agüero, fatídicos miembros de la comunidad internacional, les decimos: se equivocaron rotundamente, porque aquí, después de 10 años de la siembra del comandante, aquí estamos. Aquí estamos otra vez de nuevo.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ellen, for picking out all of these moments from the encuentro to give the audience a sense here.
Yeah, did you see me in there?
I didn't. Were you in the crowd there?
Yeah, I was in there. Martha was there too.
Okay, so the next one I'm queuing up right now. And you can tell the crowd who this is.
Oh, that's Correa. These are two former presidents.
Que lo venga a felicitar, decir que lo admiraba mucho.
Ecuador.
Un economista formado en Estados Unidos, ministro de Finanzas de Ecuador. Ecuador era totalmente tomado por la derecha. En la larga y triste noche neoliberal de los 90, las 3 segundas vueltas presidenciales que hubo en mi país, las 3 fueron derecha contra más derecha. Casi no lo creía. Pero como era un hombre que anticipaba el futuro, enseguida me dio todo su apoyo. De ahí creció una amistad que se convirtió en hermandad y solo creció con cada día que pasaba. Creo que a todos nos hace falta el comandante. Me parece que fue ayer, ese 5 de marzo del 2013, cuando Nicolás me llamaste. Estaba recorriendo un cantón en una parte muy linda del país, Piñas. Se había derrumbado un hospital le había caído un derrumbe a un hospital, había quedado inhabilitado. Estábamos atendiendo esa emergencia y me llama a decir que eran las últimas horas del comandante. Era una noticia esperada, ineludible, pero no por ello dejaba de ser tremendamente dolorosa. Ya cuando regresábamos en avión a Quito, más o menos a las 3:25 hora de Ecuador, 4:25 hora, 4:30 hora de Venezuela, ya nos llaman a dar la noticia de que el comandante Hugo Chavez había pasado a la inmortalidad. Pero como dice Luis I, cantor venezolano, los muertos que luchan por la vida nunca mueren. Claro, la noticia fue devastadora, nos destrozó el alma, pero no destrozó la esperanza. Esa esperanza que sembró Hugo, hombre de grandes proezas increíbles, pero también de una inmensa ternura, sensibilidad, solidaridad. Y Chávez vive, Chávez está entre nosotros, y el mejor
That's good. Let's go to the next
regalo que le podemos dar.
Sure.
because I want to have plenty of time for these people.
Absolutely. Just give me one moment here. We're doing a complicated program tonight, but want to bring you really the opportunity to see for yourselves what Martha and Ellen were able to participate in.
Y ahí está nuestro querido presidente Luis Arce Catacora, mejor conocido como Lucho Arce, presidente del Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia. Por favor.
Muchísimas gracias. Muy buenas tardes a todas, todos. Saludar a todos los comandantes. Aquí estamos llenos de comandantes. Está nuestro comandante Raúl Castro, que nos acompaña. Nuestro comandante de Nicaragua, el comandante Ortega. Y también nuestro comandante Maduro, que está acá con nosotros. Saludar a todos los presidentes, expresidentes que están acá, al pueblo venezolano, un gran saludo. Desde la hija predilecta de Simón Bolívar, desde Bolivia, un gran abrazo para el pueblo venezolano. Tantas cosas que uno podría decir del comandante Chávez. Muchas se han dicho, no vamos a reiterarlas, pero sí hay una anécdota que yo tengo que me gustaría transmitir especialmente para los jóvenes, para aquellos que tuvieron dudas todavía de que el socialismo es un camino mejor para la humanidad, un camino de justicia, de oportunidades, de igualdad. El año 99, en nuestro país se debatía un libro que había salido pocos meses antes, que es El fin de la historia de Fukuyama. Un libro que básicamente lo que nos planteaba era que ya no iba más el socialismo, peor, empezar a pensar en el comunismo, que la etapa del desarrollo de la sociedad había sido y es, dicen ellos, el capitalismo. Y en ese momento, el auge del neoliberalismo. Y nosotros, los viejos socialistas allá, en pleno proceso neoliberal en mi país, discutíamos la alternativa al modelo neoliberal, ahí donde creamos nuestro modelo económico, social, comunitario, productivo, que lo pusimos en práctica en nuestro país. Pero En esos debates tuvimos la fortuna y la alegría que a fines de ese año 99 el comandante Chávez ganaba con más del 56% de las elecciones aquí en Venezuela. Y esto es lo más importante.
Did you do Nicaragua, Ortega? Can you?
Yeah, I can. I just thought, it might be good to bring Martha in and maybe play some of the rest of the videos after. Or, I mean, we could play them now if you want, but I'm just trying to be conscious of time. Make sure we leave enough time for Martha too.
I've got 7:40. Okay, yes, you're right. That sounds good.
Yeah, and we're gonna link and send the links out to all of the different clips, as well as to the entire encuentro that you can watch, which features, I don't know how many speakers it was total, probably
Yes.
more than a dozen, right, Ellen?
Yes.
As well as music. But in the meantime, and if you just hold for 1 second, I want to introduce you to our next speaker, who I'll put up right now. And our next speaker is Martha Schmidt, as you heard, Ellen's roommate on the delegation. Martha is from Seattle, Washington. Martha, are you phoning in from Seattle right now? I think you might be struggling to get off mute.
I'm off mute now. Yes.
Yeah, so you calling in from Washington now?
I'm in the Seattle area. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we're both coasts are represented. Good.
Oh, yeah.
So a little bit about Martha before she starts her presentation. Martha is a retired labor and equal employment lawyer. She also worked as a union and community organizer and a college teacher. She belongs to the National Lawyers Guild, the International Committee, and currently is co-chair of the Human Rights Framework Project. So working against unilateral coercive measures, sanctions against war and for the right of health for all of the people and for the planet. She visited Venezuela in 2013 as a acompañante. Is that an observer?
Yes, that's more than an observer.
Okay, you can tell us exactly what that is and educate us. But she was down there for the municipal elections on December 8th, and she has also been involved, and you're going to hear more about it, the Free Alex Saab campaign. So, Martha, the floor is yours.
So if you want to put up my slides, I will
Absolutely
go forward.
Mm-hmm. Let me cue those up for you. And there you are. And you just tell me when you want to advance to the next slide.
Yes, so next.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm going to try to do is talk about how the peace and justice movement can use international law, and particularly for popular education, for advocacy, and why international law is really important in order to change our culture of American exceptionalism. And then I'm going to focus a bit on the US alternative to having a hot war with Venezuela, and that is the use of these unilateral coercive measures, what many people call sanctions. And this is basically economic aggression. And then I'm going to talk about how the US relations with Venezuela are violating international diplomatic law. And I'll speak specifically about the seizure and prosecution of the diplomat Alex Saab. Next slide. So just a couple of things as far as the impact of the delegation on me, because as I said, I've been there as the acompañante, which is like an observer of elections, but it requires a certain degree of solidarity with the country, not just coming like from the Carter Center or something and pronouncing on Venezuelan elections. So I've been thinking a lot about how we can do work that's not necessarily just Venezuela specific, but that can help to change the way US engages in foreign relations and US aggression. So a couple of things that I have been thinking about. One is that the aggression that we see against Venezuela continues regardless of which party's in office, that these are a foreign policy catastrophe and all branches of our government are involved in it. And that this belief in American exceptionalism allows this kind of aggression to continue. And it's in the face of all kinds of denial of democracy and human rights in the US. I also, like Ellen, had a really strong and positive response to being at this encuentro mundial for these 3 days. And the particular things that we did in addition to that, besides the presentation on Alex Saab's case, was were a special meeting we had with Alex Saab's wife and his other her family members and the lawyer for Alex Saab in Venezuela. And also, I think the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and something that we need to communicate, is that the Venezuelans see themselves as protagonists of history, and they see Alex Saab's resistance as part of this struggle against US imperialism. They see him as symbolic. They see him as resisting in the tradition of the global South and the radical tradition of the Americas. And one thing that I realized, and I will do a little pitch here for the book that Ellen is recommending on Simón Bolívar, and that is that it's quite apparent that the tradition of Bolívar and Bolivarian socialism is that it focuses on equality and solidarity. And I think to a much greater extent than those principles are ever emphasized here, where we tend to look at liberty as in many ways as a negative concept. Next slide. So I want to talk first about unilateral coercive measures, just so that people are clear what they are as a legal matter. And I think that it helps to sharpen our arguments with other anti-war and justice activists. So there are economic acts of hostile nature taken by a state to compel a change in the policy of another state. So we know about trade embargoes, interruption of financial flows, freezing of assets, travel bans, sanctions to punish certain people of influence. I would also say, as far as this situation, the US and the United Kingdom, with respect to Venezuela, have actually added to these categories because they've seized and taken for their own use and denied to Venezuela assets that, and I'm referring specifically to Citgo, the Venezuelan oil company here in the US, and the gold reserves, which are held in the UK. Also, there's a thing called secondary sanctions that target countries and businesses and people who trade with countries that the US has imposed sanctions on. And I think two other things is that, as far as Alex Saab's case, the fact that he was kidnapped, tortured, prosecuted is also related to the fact that he traveled to Iran, which is another state that is targeted by the United States for unilateral coercive measures. And I'll also just mention that we can have a situation where there are sanctions with military force or without, before and after. And all unilateral sanctions are illegal, but there are sanctions that have been permitted if they comply with Security Council decision-making under the UN Charter, but those still have to comply with human rights standards. Next slide. So what makes these sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, illegal? We look at different sources of international law, and the authority of those are identified in the statute for the Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, and that's part of the UN Charter through Article 93. So it's binding on all UN members, including the United States. The usual sources of authority include things like treaties, the UN Charter, customary law, general principles of law, and then declarations of the UN General Assembly can become customary law. We also have international law that is made up of judicial decisions, like the Nicaragua versus US case of the International Court of Justice, and the teachings of what are called the highly qualified legal publicists, the legal scholars, the experts. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those people who authored an amicus curiae brief in Alex Saab's appeal. Next slide. Next slide. So,
are you seeing those advance?
This is good. Now I see it.
Yeah.
Okay,
good.
So the UN Charter, of course, is a treaty. The US ratified that. It's been in force since October 24th, 1945. So this is very old international law. And as you can see, it requires members to settle international disputes by peaceful means, not to exacerbate the international peace and security system. It specifically requires under Article 2.4 that all members refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent. So I think 2.4 is the thing to pay attention to, especially with respect to US relations with Venezuela. Next slide. So there's also the treaty that the US has ratified and that's in effect in this Western Hemisphere, the Charter of the Organization of American States, and that has even more specific legal obligations that pertain to US and Venezuela. And the thing I want to especially mention is Article 18, that no state has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. This prohibits not only armed force, but also any other form of interference or attempted threat. And Article 19, which is a very specific provision and very much related to UCMs, no state may use or encourage coercive measures of an economic or political character in order to force the sovereign will of another state or obtain from it advantages. These say everything about US UCMs against Venezuela. Next slide. There's also an obligation on the part of every country who's a member of the UN and who has all of whom are bound by customary law, which is incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which goes back almost as far as the UN Charter to 48, as well as the two treaties that came out of that, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. These human rights law regime provides that there's an entitlement to a social and international order that protects human rights, and that no state is permitted to engage in activity aimed at destroying human rights, which of course is a problem with unilateral coercive measures. There's also a common article in these two covenants which talk about the right of every country and the people there to freely dispose of their wealth and resources, and based on a principle of mutual benefit in international law, and that every people, every country has a right to its own means of subsistence, which of course coercive measures target. Next slide. There's also some other, I've listed in the next few slides from 1970 through the 90s to up to the present, some other sources which focus on the importance of maintaining friendly relations and non-interference in and non-threat in economic, political, or other life of a country. So you see here, this is an old one, and this from the 70s, talking about use of economic, political, or other type of measures to coerce. So that's an early statement. Next slide. So, and this is something that is happening now, and so people in the US should take note, because the tides are changing. So there is a long and growing opposition by the majority of UN members to unilateral coercive measures. There was a report that the UN Secretary General had put out, which came out in 2006 on the illegality of unilateral measures. Also, there have been General Assembly resolutions, and each time they are adopted, there's an increasing number of states declaring unilateral coercive measures a violation of international law, and this increasing north-south split and resistance to US hegemony. And there was in April, there was a UN Human Rights Council resolution, which 33 countries to 13 voted for that. That was submitted by the non-aligned movement. And so that, interestingly, took place, even though Russia was thrown out of the UN Human Rights Council. By the way, Venezuela didn't get to vote on that because they weren't allowed to vote, and haven't been allowed to vote in either the Human Rights Council or the UN General Assembly, because they haven't been able to pay, Venezuela hasn't been able to pay its dues because of sanctions. Another problem of sanctions. Next slide. Then this Nicaragua case, which many of us older people know about, which was decided in '86 by the International Court of Justice. This is very important, and it pertains to Venezuela directly, because the court actually looked at all kinds of US acts of aggression, and they looked at the OAS Charter Article 19, which I mentioned, as well as the General Assembly resolution, which I just also showed you. So they found those to be statements of international law, and they really focused on the broader concept of non-intervention and non-interference, and as including lots more than armed force. So I think it's important that we have this long-term court decision, I'll also just mention that this case also defined terrorism for the first time in international law, and it was the US engaging in terrorism against Nicaragua. Next slide. So this is a more recent and specifically related to the denial of human rights as a result of the use of unilateral coercive measures. And this was the Vienna Declaration as an important statement of international law. So as you see here, the focus is on states being allowed to trade and have the right to development in relation to the protection of human rights. And a very important and set of rights, which I focus on a lot, is the right of everyone to enjoy a standard of living adequate for their health and well-being, including food, medical care, housing, and necessary social services. So that's a focus that has to be looked at when you see a country like the US using unilateral coercive measures. Next slide. So I think I've talked about some of these, but basically the issue, these underlying assumptions for the illegality have to do with, you know, the capacity of country to be sovereign, to have economic subsistence, which is freedom. The importance of preventing unilateral coercive measures because of the whole long history of colonialism and the continuing problem of imperialism, which has prevented states from being sovereign and exercising their rights as sovereigns. And then the other issue with unilateral coercive measures is how many areas of accepted international law those affect, such as the collective right to development, the rights, commercial rights relating to trade, all the human rights, whether individual or collective, and humanitarian law, because it may be possible to make a case that unilateral coercive measures rise to violations of international humanitarian law. Next slide. These are a couple of experts, legal experts, who actually have looked at US and EU unilateral coercive measures, which have been used on Venezuela. And Desaias in 2018 likens the modern day sanctions and blockades to medieval sieges. And I think that's a very interesting and illustrative way to think about what's being attempted and the impact. He also, I think, is very, in this particular report, was very savvy in recognizing what I call the weaponization of human rights, that is manipulation of public opinion and use of PR and phony human rights rhetoric to give the impression that it's the US that is engaging in human rights activity when it imposes UCMs. And then Idris Jasseri, who was a special rapporteur, talks about precipitating the economic and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, that is completely beyond the UN Charter, which requires peaceful settlement of disputes. And also, I would say that we can see that, especially in the period of the pandemic, to the use of the denial of trade and the inability, for example, of Venezuela to get, for example, ventilators and other important medical equipment and supplies. Next slide, please. So now in 2023, I mean, I count 35 of these countries, but some people have counted more than 40, and it depends on, I guess, how extensive the regime is. I have looked at the US Treasury Department site and some other places, but what we do know is, that the oldest one is the Helms-Burton regime, the blockade against Cuba. By the way, the US tells us this is an embargo because a blockade is actually an illegal act of war under international law. Another thing, I think many people are familiar with the countries that are being targeted, but the majority of them actually are in Africa. And of course, they include, I've said earlier, Iran, and people know about China and Russia, but quite a number of countries: Syria, Libya, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan. I put here financial impact as billions, but it's actually, if you look at all of these, it's definitely in the trillions. And the human impact is just, you can't quantify it really, the overall impact. But there was a report done for the year 2017-18 by CPR, and they concluded that at least 40,000 deaths in that year were attributable to the unilateral coercive measures. So that's a very specific damage that Venezuela can claim, which is, of course, incalculable. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about Alex Saab's case, which is related to these unilateral coercive measures, of course. It's about Venezuela's resistance, his case. So just a little bit of detail. He was appointed a special envoy by the foreign minister on April 9th, 2018, so about 5 years ago. A year later, he was personally named by the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control as a person to be sanctioned. He made trips in March and April of 2020 to Iran, of course, during the pandemic, trying to negotiate food, medicines, humanitarian supplies, refined gasoline, all kinds of things that were in desperate demand in that period. So there was a third visit for him that was scheduled. The Venezuelan foreign minister had proposed it to Iran, and Iran issued an invitation on June 8th. And so Alex Saab left Venezuela on June 12th. This is 2020. He was carrying a letter from Maduro and invitations to some high-level Iranian officials to come for an official visit to Venezuela. That day, while his plane stopped to refuel in Cape Verde, West Africa, the authorities seized him. His arrest had been demanded by the US, and they stated they would be extraditing him for, quote, conspiracy to make bribe payments to Venezuelan foreign officials. These allegations, I want you to note, did not involve any actions in the US or any US victims. And 2 days after Alex Saab's arrest, Secretary of State Pompeo wrote an email. This was found during discovery in the case. In the email, he asked if there was a way to find that Alex Saab was not a diplomat because his passport was, quote, awarded by criminals. So right after this, Venezuela and Iran immediately protested the arrest of him, but Cape Verde kept Alex Saab for 16 months. And during this time, he was tortured and denied health care. Next slide. This is also, an example, his case of how the US punishes a diplomat for his country's resistance. In September 2021, there were protests by foreign ministers from both Russia and China about the violations of international diplomatic law in Alex Saab's case. The treaty which governs diplomatic relations, Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, has been in effect since 1964.
Is it okay? Can you not hear it, honey?
I
Okay.
can hear.
Sorry, there's just some background noise. If
Oh,
people
okay.
can mute themselves who aren't speaking.
All right. I hope everybody can hear. This treaty's been in, and the US ratified the treaty, and it's long-term customary international law. So despite this whole international legal regime, he was rendered to the United States on October 16th of 21. He was removed from Cape Verde by the DEA. And I say, and others do too, that this was effectively a kidnapping. There wasn't an extradition treaty between Cape Verde and the US. And the US knew, and this is in Pompeo's book, that he was a diplomat with immunity. And the US communicated to Cape Verde that he was to be held. And they also misused the Interpol system to have him arrested. It's quite likely that the US was fully aware of the torture and the denial of health care that he was subjected to in Cape Verde. Next slide. The punishment that the US has engaged in is in complete disregard of international law and policy, and in disregard of the African regional courts. He was rendered to the US on October 16th, despite a decision and a ruling in March and June 21 by ECOWAS, which is an appellate West African court for trade, and it has jurisdiction over Cape Verde. That court said the arrest was unlawful and that Alex Saab should be released. There were also provisional measures imposed in June 2021 by the UN Human Rights Committee that he should not be extradited to the US while his case was under their consideration. There were also provisional measures imposed by the African Human Rights Commission ordering Cape Verde not to extradite this diplomat to the US. And then finally, despite the petitions to Cape Verde, which were based on diplomatic immunity under the convention and customary law, and were sent by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions and 4 special rapporteurs, including the special rapporteur on torture, those were all just ignored. And all of these were high-level legal experts working for the United Nations and reporting to the UN Human Rights Council. Next slide. I think he is a symbol, and that's the way Venezuelans and many other people see him, a symbol of resistance to US exceptionalism, to our legal imperialism. And what is now happening is that his case is showing how crudely politicized our federal courts are. So when Mr. Saab moved to dismiss the indictment on the basis of his diplomatic immunity, he had a hearing, and his legal team put on a couple of days of evidence. They submitted over 30 documents, and those were accepted into evidence, and they showed that he was a diplomat and that he was a special envoy diplomat. And the US government admitted that 29 of these were true and correct. They didn't provide any witness or documents to challenge that Mr. Saab was not a diplomat or that he was not accepted by Iran as a diplomat. Nevertheless, on December 23rd last year, the judge of the district court denied the motion to dismiss, finding these amazing facts, or making these amazing conclusions. One, that Alex Saab was, quote, no diplomat at all. That because the President of the United States didn't recognize the Maduro government, Mr. Saab's immunity as a diplomat could be disregarded. The court concluded that only permanent representatives, not special envoys, were real diplomats. This was despite a case precedent in that district, and that held just the opposite. And then finally, that customary law didn't protect this transit-based immunity. And they actually said that he hadn't gotten consent for transit from the US, which is just preposterous. Anyway, next slide. So of course there was an appeal by his defense team, and the appeal goes to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which handles appeals from the Southern District of Florida, where the district court is. Some members of the National Lawyers Guild have assisted in filing amicus briefs on behalf of their clients to aid the appeals court. The idea of these is to help the court, the appeals court, understand what the international law is, or the law. And these were all submitted by the middle of March. And so I want to just mention one of these amicus briefs, which our former Lawyers Guild President David Gespas wrote, submitted on behalf of his client, Professor Eileen Denza, who is really one of the foremost experts on diplomatic law, having written a book in 2018 and a commentary on that Vienna Convention. She also incidentally was legal counsel in the UK in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Next slide. And this is what she had to say about the law and the case. She says, you know, the principles governing diplomatic relations and immunity are important to protect, that this is a matter of considerable importance, that the US can't alter Alex Saab's status or terminate his functions by recognizing a different president. She said his immunity as a special envoy affects wherever he goes, and even now he is still in transit to assume his duties in Iran while he is detained in the US. That never before has a transit state arrested a duly accredited special envoy in transit to a receiving state which has recognized the envoy status, and that his continued detention in the US is a violation of his inviolability as Venezuela's special envoy on this special mission to Iran, that it's illegal. And so the question is what, you know, that's the last slide. I just, you know, post everyone what to do. And also, I just want to mention that I have also prepared a compilation of the US violations of international law, which I think Brian can post here, which includes unilateral coercive measures, as well as these specific violations of the Vienna Convention, both in Alex Saab's case and then in a previous situation in 2019 when we had people trying to protect the Venezuelan embassy in Washington. And then the other thing that I have tried to just sketch out a little bit is another kind of US coercion through the National Endowment for Democracy. But basically there's going to be a week of, more than a week of action in support of Alex Saab, his freedom, and also against sanctions. And you can find out about local events and activities on the Alliance for Global Justice website. And then I don't know, maybe we want to see if we have questions, or I'm happy to take them, or however you want to handle that with both.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I'm going to bring Ellen back too. And I'll just put myself up. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. If you, Martha and Ellen, if you have the time,
Sure.
if you would like to ask a question, you can just raise your virtual hand that's under reactions, and I'll unmute you, allow you to unmute yourself, and bring you up so you can ask a question. I know there was one in the chat that can maybe get you started. Someone asked if while you were on your delegation, you saw any manufacturing facilities or cottage industries down there.
I don't recall that.
No?
No.
We just saw the collectives. I wouldn't call that a cottage industry, though.
Yeah.
No.
And this is a comment that someone else, that Michelle put in before she
I had to go.
left, but suggesting that folks attend the America's Policy Forum at American University on the 29th. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Code Pink is helping to put this together.
Oh yeah, yeah. Michelle from Code Pink.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
well, that makes a lot of sense then. I will pop the link in, because we're promoting this on our website as well. It should be a great event. But I will certainly post that link in the chat as soon as I can get my hands on it, and also send it out in a follow-up email.
There's
But
another thing I want to mention that's coming up besides the days in May, starting on April 27th, that will highlight Alex Saab's case and the resistance to unilateral coercive measures. In the UN Human Rights Council, that this latest resolution that was adopted envisions there being a conference during the last session of the UN Human Rights Council this year. It's usually in October, November, and it would be open also to civil society groups to participate, as I understand. So it might be a way for different organizations to come together to express ourselves as, opposed to this, and to try to help undo the influence of the U.S. government in the Human Rights Council, because the U.S. is a member of the Human Rights Council, and obviously it's not conveying certainly many of our views about international law and human rights. So that's something we can we can find out about as the year continues, but it is actually going to be open to civil society.
that's really good to know. And that, I think you actually partially answered this next question that I see in the chat. To me, it's kind of like the question. How has the United States avoided being called into court over all of these violations of international law that you mentioned?
Well, I think that this is a long-standing problem that I think that unfortunately there are specific ways this happens. One is, threats that are made, specific threats. Another is threats that there won't be aid or money that has been promised forthcoming to particular states. There's also, I'm quite sure, and this is partly the role of the National Endowment for Democracy, is the organizations and people being paid not to do what's legally right, and there are ways that people can be persuaded, shall we say, in quotes. No, the US media is basically, I see somebody's asking about the US media. What the US media is doing is now trying to, this latest case of Venezuela corruption, the prosecutions of the oil company folks, well, there's one of the people who's been charged is a Colombian businessman named Pulido, and he, in the news article from Agence France Presse, there was it said he was a confederate of Alex Saab, implying that Alex Saab was involved in the cryptocurrency allegations, which is totally, I mean, it's just like just putting them together, putting his name in the same news article. So now we have to do our own work, to get the media out. And then also, as Ellen said, be looking to use Venezuela analysis, Telesur, Counterpunch, articles that people are writing, to try to bring the information out. But I just want to say that one of the reasons I like to try to get people to rethink how to use international law is because it's out there. People can't say, oh, that's not a treaty, or that it doesn't exist. But the thing is that it's not, even a lot of lawyers think that international law isn't really law. So we have to reclaim international law for the people's movements.
Thanks, Martha. I know you had something to say on this, Ellen.
No, I'm just thrilled that we got a lot of background in the international law aspect, because I think Martha is so right that we don't use it well, and we don't use the UN Charter on these various things. But what I wanted to bring it back to the delegation experience, because it was so unusual that we were there at this particular time that's celebrating an enormous transformation that's taking place throughout Latin America at a time when many places are moving in the exactly opposite direction. And many nations are moving in there, particularly in the West. But I wanted to remind people that even though you didn't get to hear all the presidential presentations, that we have that. I don't know, Brian, I don't see that you're able to put it on there, the encuentro.
Oh, I can put it in now. Yes, that's a good.
I put on my email for anyone who also wants to get to see the International Women's Day March. We were there on Women's Day, which was just an amazing, amazing in that there were so many people involved, and women were so well organized with their T-shirts and their working groups marching together. I actually had that, but so what I'd really like to do, because you got a lot from me, is to ask Martha, because Martha she spoke up at the delegation in different large audiences, large outdoor gatherings, much more than I did. And she really was very strong and comprehensive about support and solidarity. So I wish you'd say a little bit more about your experience with the delegation, Martha.
Well, I would just say that I haven't been on lots of delegations, but I've been on a few with the Lawyers Guild, and I've been with Pastors for Peace to Cuba. But really, everybody was so, we were received so warmly, and I've never been hugged by so many strangers, is one of the things I've been saying. But yeah, people wanted us, they enveloped us. They said, come and talk, like the International Women's Day or the rally in Valencia with the big banners supporting Alex Saab. Yeah, it was really kind of overwhelming, that they really, when I think about the impact of the sanctions, it's amazing that people make that distinction between us coming in peace and solidarity and our government. It's really wonderful, and it shows great maturity and resolve on the part of the Venezuelans in so many ways, that they're very clear about who can benefit from the revolution and what the revolution is for, and who to be in solidarity with. Very, very exciting to be there. And it was just really amazing to be in the same room with all this enthusiasm and solidarity.
That
Yeah,
cottage
and,
industry question may be something that is related to the medical day that we went to in Valencia when they, was it in Valencia? Yes, it was Valencia, where they distributed and actually carried out medical practice and gave out all kinds of prosthesis and various wheelchairs and things. That was, it seemed to me that it came from some cottage industry efforts. Don't you think?
Well, as you recall, I couldn't go because I was sick, but I had the wonderful experience, though, of learning about the primary care system of Venezuela, which I'd read about in this wonderful book, Revolutionary Doctors. And basically, this physician, who of course was trained by the Cuban doctors, came to our hotel room, and a person who was actually the spouse of our Valencia leader stayed with me for a few hours to make sure I was okay. And there was no charge, and I got medicine. It was just like, wow, I can't. And then about 2 weeks ago, the doctor who treated me got in touch with me on WhatsApp to see how I was doing. And I was thinking, this would never happen if somebody came to the US. Never. Anyway, it was wonderful. Yeah, Cuba too.
And the pills they gave you worked. It wasn't just.
Oh yeah, no, I got the real deal. Anyway, it's a very, and that's one thing that if we could just get rid of the sanctions or even do something to reduce them, what they're doing with their health system is really exciting, and you know, that deserves to see the light of day and thrive. It will benefit so many more countries than Venezuela too. The spirit of internationalism that the Cuban doctors have and healthcare workers have started is infectious. But Biden just extended Obama's executive order saying Venezuela is an extraordinary and unusual threat to the United States. So everybody should protest that.
how, right? That's the one that always bewilders me. How in any way could a unique national security threat to the United States? It's absurd. It's
both Cuba and Venezuela are in the same boat here, so we should join their issues together. They're trying to keep Cuba on the terrorism list, and there's massive campaigns in the US against that. And the same Venezuela's sanctions, they vary in some different departments and how it's handled in the United States, but it's pretty much the same. They're both deprivations, great punishments and deprivations.
Nicaragua too. I mean, it really is a number of countries, and it's a really stupid, bad foreign policy. So, and it really has a lot to do with having peace and justice in the world. So we have to put our heads together and try to come up with some new strategies and more collective work.
But what you were saying, Martha, is that this is really, we should look more seriously at international law to do this.
Correct. We have to be informed because people don't understand it or don't use it. We have to bring it out here because it's the US that is not being held to international law. It is the US. So but it's partly because we, the people of the US, don't demand that things change, and we don't have all the tools that we need. So.
Well, thank you for your presentation, for actually providing us with some of those tools, the information that is not readily available to us, certainly not taught to us. in school. You got to go out and find it yourself. I just put in the chat, there's an event coming up. You said, yeah, the way that we treat Cuba as well is very much linked to our Venezuela policy.
Yeah.
On May 4th at 7 p.m., we're going to be talking to Yuri Gala Lopez, who is an ambassador from Cuba to the United Nations. We're going to be talking about US-Cuba relations, but specifically what Ellen just raised, this absurd designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, which is devastating to the island nation. And MAPA, Mass Peace Action, is very likely to be starting a campaign in opposition to making that designation the law of the land, because we absolutely need to stop that. We need to get Cuba off the state sponsor of terror list. It has no business being there. But also, I just wanted to let people know, I wanted to thank you both, Martha and Ellen, and anyone listening, if you're going on a delegation and would like to bring back information as these two wonderful speakers did, we invite you to do so. Our audience, our members can only benefit. So thank you again for what you did tonight. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you to everyone.
And we're very grateful of how Brian was able to take all this and put it together and help us do this. So thank you.
Oh,
Brian.
you made it easy. You made it easy. Just to remind everyone in the audience, I will be tomorrow sending out a link to the recording, as well as all the resources that were shared. So don't worry if you didn't take down all of the links. They will be included to you in an email. And I encourage you to forward it. Share it with your friends and family, get this message out there, and get involved too. We work on these issues in our Latin America and Caribbean working group. And if you're interested in planning these programs, in advocacy, in activism, in standouts, in, just getting the message out person to person, write to us at info@masspeaceaction.org.
And I'm just adding my email in case anybody wants to contact me. Great.
Yep, we'd love to have you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Good.
Thank you both. Stay strong and keep going.
Keep the struggle going.
Keep it
Absolutely.
going.
Have a good night, everyone.